So we're going to move on through the rest of these videos in the tools section, and we're just going to start with a couple that look at some of like the very basic bits for those of you who are newer to Lightwave. If you've been around longer, then you can maybe skip a couple of videos until you see something that looks a bit more new and interesting, or just take a peek if you want to see some of the things that are ever so slightly changed. And the first thing that we're going to look at in that sort of set is going to be the surface editor, because this has had a few little changes that you might want to just check in on. So this is where you would have all of the surfaces listed for all of your different materials. At the minute we've just got one object loaded which only has one material, so that's why we only see the one here. Pretty standard. What you have is you have your material list here on the left, and you have your surface settings here on the right. There's a couple of different areas to the surface settings. So there's the actual material property itself. This is the main material property. And you can change to different materials, different material types, which we'll see, as we go along, nice and easily there. You've got this bottom section here. Now, these settings are obviously for the material selected, but they're not specific to the material that you have here. Sorry, they're specific to the surface selected, but they don't change with the material. In other words, these options apply no matter which material you have set here. You then have the shading model tab for the surface, where you have a couple of different rendering types: cell, photoreal, shadow catcher, and you have settings for the alpha channel and reflections and refractions, and we will look at those in due course. Got a couple of little settings over here: files, so you can load or save different surfaces that you make; presets, so as you can load or save things as presets, or you can open the actual preset shelf here from where you can grab a preset surface and just load its settings like this. Got preview, which allows you to either directly in the viewport or with a floating window bring up a quick material VPR preview here, and this basically just gives you a simple sphere. To be perfectly honest, I often find this to be of limited use. It's a nice little thing that's there, but normally you need to see what your material really looks like on your object, so it's just as easy to use VPR itself, quite frankly, and take a look at your actual object with the actual surface on it. And you can do that in the floating window here, or of course you can just do it in your main viewport. Lastly then, you have the node graph, and this is one of the important things in the surface editor, is that loads of stuff now is done through the nodes. You can set, some of the basic settings on the actual material here just by, changing these values. But if you want to get in detailed, then you're going to be using the nodal setup here. Now, there's loads of stuff here. A lot of it is if you're doing really advanced work. But basically you have two nodes that are standard in the node editor. You have an input node and you have an output node, in this case the actual surface node itself. The input node gives you a whole bunch of different pieces of information, either about the object that this surface belongs to or the spot that is being rendered. You remember back in Foundations we said that the photorealistic rendering is for each spot in the scene, each spot on a mesh, which pretty much means a pixel, a sampled pixel. Then all of the incoming and outgoing light is sampled for that bit for all the surrounding lights and the direct and indirect illumination and so on and so forth, right? And this is the information about that sampling process. So you've got stuff like the item ID, which is the actual object ID number. Every object that's loaded into your scene has an internal ID. Yes, it's got its name, of course, but it's got an ID number in the scene. You've got the pixel X and Y, so this is the X and Y of the pixel in the render that the current ray is hitting. Info about the frame width and height, how big your camera frame is. Obviously we're talking spots and we're talking individual light rays, yes, so you've got the position that the ray is striking, you've got the direction that the ray is coming from, you've got how far it has travelled, you've got what type it is. Obviously there will be multiple types all striking the same spot. There'll be diffuse rays, specular rays, reflection, indirect GI and so on. For GI you've got the number of bounces, so when a ray is hitting a particular spot, is it from the first bounce, the second bounce, what's the world position of this spot. The spot of course is on a mesh because that's what we're rendering, are the meshes, right? So what are the normals for that, be it the deformed normal or the smooth normal or the actual geometric normal. What's the object's position in space? Which side of the surface are we looking at? Which polygon in the object are we looking at? Which of the mesh elements of the object are we looking at? And so on and so forth. And when I say looking at, I mean contained within this pixel that is currently being sampled. And obviously as we go through, as something is rendered, and we render from one pixel to the next, to the next, to the next, then obviously this surface input is giving all of this information at each pixel on this mesh for this surface. As I say, really advanced uses that you would use most of this for. It's if you're going to start almost creating your own shaders using the nodes. And that's a fair bit beyond what we're going to be going into in this training. That would suit an entire training series of its own, quite frankly. But what you would want to do, of course, if you are creating a shader, a material, right, is that material needs to evaluate light coming from lights, coming from GI, and so on and so forth. It needs to sample the surface colour and the surface properties for reflection and diffuse and figure out what the light does because of those properties and so on and so forth. So you can get information about the surface here. Which way is the polygon facing? Which way is the light coming from? How strong is the light? How far has it travelled? Etc, etc, etc. And you can use that information in the construction of a shader. To be perfectly honest, if you were really that in-depth and into it, you probably would not bother doing it here in nodes. You'd just code it. You'd just jump into the SDK and you'd just write a node from scratch. And of course, you'd get all of this information in the Lightwave SDK, which is what it really is here in Nodal. It's just the SDK that you would program your own Nodal plugin with, exposed here in the nodes. If you are a developer creating your own node materials or node shaders, then this can be a useful way just to sort of spitball some ideas without coding, compiling, loading into Lightwave, coding, compiling, loading into Lightwave. You can just sort of play around a bit. But for your average everyday user, bit much. Otherwise, we have the output node, which is where everything that has been assessed within the node editor then goes onto the surface and, comes out rendered in our final image. So of course, you have a material, such as in this case the conductor material, and that's hooked up to the material, and there you go. And you've got a couple of other options, such as normal, bump, displacement, clip map. We'll see those in time. You might have noticed that when I plugged this in, the conductor appeared over here. That's because the material that is listed here is what is ever plugged in to the nodal surface. You'll notice if I pick another one, woohoo, the node is automatically added for me. Do be aware, if you are jumping and trying a couple of different surfaces on your mesh, you will find that these nodes start to, crowd up in here. Also, if you're using something like, a texture that's actually plugged in somewhere, so I've just got a checkerboard going into the color here. This is just a simple procedural going into the color. If say, oh no, let's go to that other shader here, please. Oh, look, it hasn't. I've got to come in here and connect that to this one as well now, or instead of that one, if you take my meaning. It won't take your connections from one and add them all to the other. But it does mean that you could build up a few surfaces in here. So I could have built something up on, this standard material with some textures like that. And I could have perhaps had some other textures that were working on some, other thing over here. And I could, of course, just quickly switch between them from this place like that. So you could have multiple surfaces, multiple kinds of materials set up and switch between them for an object, and of course save it off with all of those inside of it. Of course, when it comes to nodes, there's an awful lot of stuff that we could talk about. I'm going to have to presume for this training that you have at least a basic handle on working with nodes. As I pointed out, there is separate nodal training because, frankly, if you do want to get into the nodes and do stuff, that's another whole training series to itself. But it is quite important that you have at least a basic handle on the nodes because an awful lot of the surfacing work we will do in here. Notice as well, I said that you click the edit node graph to get into the nodes. You can also just double click on the surface itself here for speed and ease. But otherwise, there we go. That is the, quick run through of the surface editor and the basic stuff that you'll need to know as we start hooking things up and rendering them off. And with that out the way, we shall continue to some of the other little topics that we have.